Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? If you can hear me, say please, good afternoon. Oh, you can hear me. Great. Wonderful. Thank you for being here. Welcome. I appreciate all of you making the time to join us. We have a really exciting program for you today. But before we start, just a few things. I want to thank Microsoft, Akhtar Badshaw, and all of his team for helping to make this event happen and to sponsor the event. Thank you. Actually, Akhtar's team works with us throughout the year to make a lot of events possible and has partnered with us in our conference in the past, and I'm sure many of you have attended. We have a few people in the audience that I want to recognize. We have representatives from Congressman Adam Smith's office. Lynn, would you stand up, please? Thank you. And I think a representative from Susan Delbenny's office, yes? Yes, oh, great. Thank you. Anyone else that maybe I don't know but are here? I mean, all of you, of course. I know you're here and I recognize you. Congressman Reichert's office? All right, maybe not yet here. All right, so we are going to, basically the format of this event is that we're going to hear a little bit about from Microsoft, about some of their work and the connection of Microsoft to the work that all of you care about. And then Helene, Gayle, Steve Davis, and I will sit up here. I'll ask them a few questions. We'll go for about, I think, 45 minutes or so, and then take questions from the audience. We'll have volunteers who have these mics, and we'll give it to you so you could ask your questions. And I think we're ending at about 6:30. That sounds good? All right, so I'm going to invite Akhtar Badshaw, who I know and a lot of you know and have met at previous events, to come up and talk to us a little bit about Microsoft's work.
Thank you all very much, and welcome to Microsoft. It is indeed our pleasure to host you all here. I wasn't actually aware that I was going to say anything more than that, because I have just actually, in fact, landed a couple of hours ago from Morocco, so I'm not even sure why I'm here, except for two very important people. And the work that they do is really why we at Microsoft, want to ensure that people get the opportunity to hear from both the work that Care and Helene does, and Steve Davis and Pat. These are two extremely important global organizations that bring about significant change for the underprivileged around the world. Both of them have done some amazing work. Helene, obviously, with the CDC, then right here with the Gates Foundation, and now with Care, bringing that same zeal and passion to ensure that women and girls around the world get the opportunity that they deserve. And we have seen over the last, couple of months, this amazing amount of stories that are coming out about how girls, if given the opportunity, can make a difference and can change the world. Malala Yousaf is just one example of what can happen. And I think Care plays a fundamental role in bringing that to life. Path, on the other hand, takes a equally important but different approach. And it is all about ensuring that healthcare is delivered to people that need it most, and delivered in a fashion that is available to all of us. So they work around cutting-edge technologies, but more importantly, it's people on the ground that are out there making a difference. And it is just some amazing work, whether it is nutrition, whether it is population control, whether it is vaccination, you name it. millions of people, millions of lives have been impacted by both these organizations. So we at Microsoft are extremely thrilled to welcome both of you on our campus and give an opportunity to hear from you. And this is exactly what we do at Microsoft as my team with our approach in community investment. We focus on supporting nonprofit organizations that are bringing about significant change, whether it is through direct investments that we make through our programs, particularly Youth Spark, which is focused on empowering young people to imagine what their future can be and then help them realize that future, or through our employee matching gifts program, which allows them to support the work that they want to support, and the company provides the matching funds that are required to help scale that work. So at Microsoft, we feel privileged to have been put in this place, and we are in this place because of many of you who continue to use our technology and support us. So we hope that you will continue to do that, because then it allows me and my team to do some very interesting work with all of you. So once again, welcome. And I am also looking forward to this conversation. So welcome, Steve and Helene.
Thank you, Akhtar. For those of you who are not familiar with Coble Washington, just a couple of words about us is that Coble Washington is now almost 5 years old. The only statewide membership organization for the global development and global health community here in Washington State. Our goal is to really bring together all of you all who are doing this incredible work to convene you, to help you to connect to each other, to help build your capacity, and to advocate on your behalf. And to also tell this story outside of the global development and global health community, to make sure that the rest of Washingtonians understand your amazing work and take pride in this sector. And then to really nationally bring attention to Washington State as an epicenter, as one of the top hubs for this work in the country. So we're really happy when we can bring to you thought leaders like Steve Davis and Helene Gayle to help share their experiences and their thinking, as well as, we have events throughout the year. So if you're not on our email list, please join, and you'll learn about a lot of events that we have every week. So I'm going to really very briefly introduce our two incredible speakers. You read their bios and you've seen how impressive they are. And I'm just going to say a few words about them and then welcome them to join me up here. Helene Gayle, I know many of you know Helene from her days in Seattle. Many of us were heartbroken when she left Seattle, except that we were so happy that she was going to go and lead one of the top organizations in the world. Helene has been named one of Forbes' 100 most powerful women, Foreign Policy Magazine's top 100 global thinkers, and Newsweek's top 10 women in leadership. Which is incredibly wonderful that she can join us here. Helene left Seattle after being at the Gates Foundation for, I think, 8 years. To join CARE in 2006. And you'll hear a lot about the influence that she's had in CARE in helping to focus on women and girls and public-private partnerships, and her experience that she brought from the Centers for Disease Control. Steve Davis, another wonderful leader who's dear to many of us in this community, has recently joined PATH as the CEO, I think in the last year. Yes. And we used to be on the board of directors of PATH, so he's really familiar with PATH's work, and served as a business leader and strategist for a range of private and nonprofit companies, served as the CEO of Corbis, and brings all of that business experience. So we'll hear, I'm sure, a lot about public-private partnerships from his perspective as well. Please welcome them and ask them to join us up here. you have yeah, I'll hold my hand. Yours is on.
I think so. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Mine is.
Great. So I'll start. So I'm going to ask a few questions that we developed with both Helene and Steve's contribution, but also with a lot of the events that we've had in the recent months and knowing what's on all of your mind. Can you please tell us a little bit about CARE and PATH's unique role in this sector? Where you see your organizations today as opposed to the 10 years ago and how you've arrived here.
All right.
Maybe I'll ask you to go first.
Okay, go
Yes.
ahead. So first, let me start by saying how wonderful it is to be back in Seattle, and how wonderful it is to be hosted by Akhtar and Microsoft. And I think the kind of partnership that you talked about is truly what allows us to do what we do, and we so rely on our partners broadly. So thank you so much for being here, and to Bukta, who is a dear friend from many, many years. It's just wonderful to be here and to see what you've done with this global consortium here in Washington. It really makes such a difference, and I think I'm sure we will talk more about advocacy and how important people's voices are on these issues, but just to say, I think you've done such a wonderful job in really developing that. So CARE, I think a lot of people know a little bit about CARE's history. We started 70 years ago giving out care packages after World War II to help in the rebuilding efforts. Obviously, Europe is back on its feet, so CARE broadened its mission beyond what we were doing when we started, and really started looking at how could we use the machine that had been developed back in those days to really help people living in the poorest circumstances around the world, and really how could we take what was originally kind of a relief organization and look at how do you have longer term impact on people's lives, and have gradually evolved from an organization that, in the proverbial giving a fish to teaching people to fish, now to also looking at making sure that we're revolutionizing the fishing industry and that there are still fish in the stream. And so, it really is that whole continuum of how do you continue to evolve an organization so that you're not just looking at people's basic short-term needs, which are always important. Anybody who knows Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't go into a community and start by saying, do you want your rights? You ask them, do you want food and water? Because that's really what's first on people's minds. So that's critical. But if you stop there, then what you do is to give people water for a day, as opposed to helping them understand their rights to clean water and how to look at that in a long-term sustainable fashion. So really our shift has been on not just looking at the consequences of severe poverty, but also looking at the underlying causes. And how do you do your work in a way that really looks at causes and consequences together, looking at the individual, one's social position, and also the enabling environment that helps people to be able to meet their needs and their capacity. I think I'll just stop that to say, I think that's, if you say how we think we've evolved, it really is much more in thinking long-term impact, giving people capacity, but also looking at it in a way that is not just looking at consequences, but also root causes.
Thank you.
Sure, and again, I would share Helene's appreciation for both what you're doing, Bukta, and the audience today. I think it's really fantastic to see the kind of community interest and engagement in all of this work. So it's a joy to be here. So PATH, actually, to the degree that CARE's story is about post-war relief 70 years ago, PATH started about 35 years later and in a garage in Seattle, fundamentally. So it comes out of a different history, and I think that history reflects its different, unique role in the space today. I mean, it was really a history of innovation. How do we look at what is going on in the global health and say what can be done to either really transform or disruptively change the course of a disease or a course of a community intervention in a more powerful way. So particularly looking at tools and technologies was where it started, in fact, in reproductive health tools initially. And then, like care, over time grew, needs changed, geographies expanded, and now we're really sort of central to the innovation agenda in global health, and that's really our role. So we are a global health organization, but the reason we're in health, and I think this is really relevant to the title, is that our real focus is social justice, in the sense that we believe that our mission is about health access and health equity, and that people should have a right to health, and our goal is to minimize or to maximize the access to health. And the reason that's so important is because in all the work on poverty and understanding of the way the world is shaped today, there are some people in utter chronic poverty, but most of the time people move in and out of poverty toward the base of the pyramid. And to move in and out of poverty usually means some event has triggered that. And the number one event is health. So a health event is the major reason people then pull in or out. So, drought, other things happen. Sometimes it's paying for a funeral. Sometimes it's, losing a job. But it is a fundamental issue in sort of our thinking about addressing poverty and empowerment. So today now PATH has offices around the world, projects in 70 countries. We work across innovations in vaccines, in drugs, in diagnostics, in tools and devices, and then in community-based interventions, in terms of figuring out interventions in behavior change or interventions in implementation science or in other ways that really can change the course. The other differentiator I'd say is that we aren't actually a large in-the-field implementer. Our role is really in sort of upstream a little bit. We do have over half of our employees are sitting in countries around the world working very hard, but mainly to build evidence on what interventions work, to help get the uptake of that evidence, or to tap into innovation or manufacturing capabilities, other types of. So we're truly trying to create a global innovation enterprise and tapping into the best, both in terms of innovation, but also supply chain, logistics, all the things that you have to do to deliver on innovation to get it to scale.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you about this focus, Helene, on women and girls. Is this new, or is this evolved over a long period of time? And does it fit within a philosophy of how you see the fight against poverty?
So it really takes off from the last question. If you're really looking at how do you have a long-term sustained impact, part of that is looking at what are some of the things that keep some populations mired in poverty. And we know that inequity generally is part of that, but particularly gender inequity plays a huge role in continuing the cycle of poverty. So we focus on it, and I think it's an evolution of our work over time. It's the evidence that we have collected in our work over time that focusing on girls and women has a huge impact for two reasons. First of all, girls and women are disproportionately impacted by poverty. So if you look at any statistics, whether it's health or education, access to economic opportunities, et cetera, girls and women are disproportionately impacted. They bear the brunt of poverty. So, as an epidemiologist, you're taught go where the numbers are. So obviously, if you're going to try to solve a problem, you go where the problem is largest. But I think that's in some ways the negative side of it. The positive side is that we know that if you invest in the life of a girl or a woman, you have catalytic change that goes beyond just that individual. So as Dr. mentioned, if you educate a girl, you know that her outcome is going to be dramatically different. But it's not just her outcome. It's the outcome of her children. So a girl who is educated is less likely to be sold early into marriage. She's more likely to get an education, earn an income, have fewer children. Those children are more likely to go to school and get an education, and you create this virtuous cycle. And a lot of studies have been done that show that if women have equal access to education and income, they're more likely to use that in ways that enhance the family and enhance the communities. So it's the best way to get a really huge return on your investment. And there, study after study looking at if women have greater roles in policy making, there's less corruption, communities thrive more. We know even in rich nations that a third or more of women in businesses, on boards, in policy making, things just do better. And I think we all know in a kind of simplistic way that any society is going to do better if you're not leaving 50% of the potential behind. So, for all of those reasons, it's why we think that investing in girls and women is the best way to have that kind of long-lasting impact on ending poverty.
Fantastic. Steve, do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so empirical. I mean, that's the thing. It's not only sort of the obvious and right thing to do, but I've come out of a recent job where I was at a large global consulting firm and being asked a lot of time to go in and talk to people who were just had billionaires who would sort of figuring out what they going to do with their wealth. And I would always start with the number one thing you do is empower girls. And if you do nothing else, put everything through that lens because of all this evidence. In PATH, we also actually have just come through a fairly extensive strategic review, and we've sort of put our sort of outcome agenda for PATH as contributing to the reduction of of mortality and morbidity of women and girls is our primary focus. Now that's a big focus, and what are the things that we have to do to deliver on that? And they're the most vulnerable population for all the reasons that Helene was explaining in terms of access issues, but it's not as simple as just. I mean, it's not simple at all. I mean, we're working in cultures and contexts where some of the most challenging things are how to manage the problem, the issue, provide the intervention in an environment of extreme disparity in terms of rights and access, and so so then you have to dig in deeper. We have, for instance, just one simple example is we have a project that's focused a lot on HIV and AIDS care, prevention, treatment, working in Western Kenya, and really, again, building evidence. But we've actually just introduced a whole suite of interventions related to gender-based violence work in that work because the connection between access to tools and supplies and interventions related to gender-based violence is so, that connection is so high. So you just have to keep working at it almost through every angle.
Can I ask you a question about being a girl? I feel like, for Coble Washington, you all know we do an annual conference. We bring together, thought leaders from around the country and leaders here. It's rare to see a woman leader leading, a top nonprofit in the world. Wow. What is that like for you, and how can we help to promote more women in leadership positions in this sector?
Well, first, I'm happy that things have changed a lot, even in the short time that I've been there. When I first took the job at CARE, I was the only, of kind of the peer organizations of the large international NGOs, I was the only woman and head of one. Now, I think half of them are. So I think, and that's in the space of 7 years. And, I think it's pretty simple. We all know that women have equal potential, equal ability. You just have to make sure that the opportunities are there. And so it is encouraging young women to think about taking on leadership roles. It's giving young women the opportunities to experience leadership. In our programs, we have a big focus on girls' education, but it's also girls' leadership along with girls' education, because we believe that if you just educate a girl but don't also give the opportunities to experience leadership, then you're really only doing half the job. How many of you were Girl Scouts or Brownies or some sort of experience like that allowed you at a very early age, or sang in your choir or did plays, or the kinds of things that we do that allow us to use our education, but to start developing leadership skills. And so it's no different from what we do in the field to what do we need to do here in this country to be able to give people that opportunity to feel like it's okay to take on leadership roles, get comfortable with that. And in that, back to the question that you asked about our work in girls and women in general, part of that is also how do we involve boys and men in the process? Because I think if we, for so long when we've talked about these issues, we've only focused on how do you change girls' and women's perceptions. But if we're not also looking at how do we change men and boys in the perceptions that they're locked in that aren't always productive for them either, then you really haven't done the work. So we put a big focus on the engagement of boys and men in the work that we do around gender equality and gender empowerment.
Sounds great. Wonderful. Yeah. Yay. I wanted to ask you both about public-private partnerships, but I'm also thinking about a lot of the smaller organizations here in the audience. Of course, we want to hear about examples, the best practices, why you think it's important to partner with the private sector, but also maybe some thoughts about how could small organizations find ways to partner with the private sector and find a win-win.
So I think this is a evolving shift in the thinking about addressing equality and inequality issues, and also broadly global health and development. That first of all, the corporate sector particularly has been engaged in many ways all along. I mean, in post-war to now, but there's a much more conscious view in the last 10 or 15 years of the role of the private sector, and actually probably as more, in a larger frame, really the multi-sector. So you've got to solve these problems with a very conscious multi-sector approach, meaning that there's a private sector, there's a public sector, meaning government, there's likely an academic or research sector if you want to break it out as a separate sector, and there's clearly an large NGO component, and often NGOs can play an important broker role, they can play kind of a neutral, kind of party in certain environments, and so I think this is happening more and more. PATH is quite, kind of in some ways ahead of the curve on this trend, in just by the nature of the work we do. So almost every one of our projects and technologies has a private sector component. So we typically, it's just kind of in our DNA to do partnerships with private sector companies to engage, to get their IP to translate into something, at a more affordable price or for some other reason relevant to a need we've identified somewhere in the world. And that's also true on the distribution side. So PATH often doesn't go out and sort of scale up its own projects or its works. We actually rely on other NGOs, we rely on government, or we rely on the private sector to re-commercialize into channels these kinds of tools and devices. So we see it constantly as part of the work we do, and I think more and more and more NGOs are seeing it generally is whether it's part of your transactional work, sometimes it's part of your philanthropic strategy, and certainly there's this increasing view of shared value is sort of these kinds of engagements with corporate sectors. I think to your second point, so I've worked with a lot and have been part of and started and engaged with lots of small nonprofits over the years, and there is equally, and maybe it's a different kind of role, it's not like the big CSR with Coke kind of thing, but there are equally opportunities locally to not only look for philanthropic support from the industry or private sector, but actually so many of the challenges we're working on at the local level have to still do with how do I get something to someone, how do I make use of media to communicate an idea or change behavior, how do I convene people, and the role of I think there's a fair, as someone who ran for a long time ran a local business and grew a fairly large local business over time, is you actually there's compelling opportunities to find those places where you want to hook into those kind of community level activities and bring not only the checkbook, which I think is often a mistake, that's the primary ask, but more often to bring some of your business capabilities, some of your volunteer interests, some of those things I think are where the ask needs to start with.
Yeah, just to add a few things, and I think in some ways one of the things that is most encouraging in the last 5 years is the shift in the way that corporations and NGOs are working together. And I think it's a really new and really different model in many ways. And it is the evolution of what was the traditional CSR. I think for a very long time, corporations felt, well, we want to be responsible corporate citizens. So, we have a philanthropic arm, and we do, we provide resources to do something good in a community, and that's great. And there have been a lot of philanthropic dollars that have made corporate philanthropic dollars that have made a big difference. But I think now people are thinking a lot more about, as you mentioned, this kind of notion of shared values, that there really is this mutually beneficial relationship between creating wealth and creating social value. And, if you think about our country or any other country, in fact, wealth creation had a huge role to play in also creating social value. And if you look at those two things as being very interconnected, you think about it in a very different way than charity. You look at it as recognizing, and particularly more and more for large global companies, where emerging markets are going to be the future economic engine, that there's a real value in creating social good in those very same communities at the same time. And now it becomes part of a business imperative, and not just off to the side as a social mission. And so I think that sort of sense of this shared values has really, in many ways, changed and invigorated the kind of partnerships that we can have with corporations. And it means, for us on the NGO side, so often when we thought about partnerships, it was with organizations that were like us. Now I think we recognize that our impact is greatly enhanced by working more with organizations that are less like us, because that's where you can really extend and have that kind of synergy. So, doing a lot more in the corporate arena. Just to give a couple of interesting sorts of examples. So, with Walmart, for instance, we're doing a project with poor women in India who were cashew growers, helping to develop their ability to grow better and higher quality cashews that now are being sold back to Walmart. And so they're creating a sustainable and locally sourced product that is also becoming a huge income stream for poor rural women. In Madagascar with General Mills recently bought Haagen-Dazs. 80% of the world's vanilla comes from Madagascar. So the same sort of project where by working with local farmers, and it's working with farmers who used to just grow, now they're also helping them to develop the ability to process, because processing is where you get the bigger money. And they're locally sourcing. It's more environmentally sustainable. It's a better long-term source. They're also helping the community by creating an income stream, helping to develop education and community development around that. So these are the kinds of things that I think are really helping us to extend what we do. The work that we've been doing for years with Microsoft, helping us to develop new technologies, particularly around maternal health platforms and other things that allow us to be able to really create and extend the ability to reach hard to reach populations. So I could go on, but I just think that this is an area where we're being able to see where using the scale, the scope, and the different types of expertise that the corporate sector has, is really helping us enhance our work. And I think it's, as Steve said, I think smaller NGOs can take advantage of the same sorts of things, and thinking about where are there synergies between what you do and companies of all different sizes, including companies that are indigenous to the countries in which you're working. Because I think it's an area we often don't think about, is how do we tap into the businesses in different countries around the world that are from those countries, homegrown, that might be good business partners as well.
I have one last question, and then we'll open up for the audience questions. So I wanted to ask you, Helene, about policy and advocacy, about the why is advocacy, well, first of all, how do you define it? What is it? And why is it important? And how can we, as a community, be involved in that effort?
Oh, definitions. That's always hard. It's like one of those things, you know it when you see it, advocacy. But no, I guess broadly speaking, it's the tool to bring about policy change. It is what you use to be able to shift policies. We think it's hugely important for the work that we do, again, in the way of how do you extend what you do. So we're a large organization, 80 countries, we reached 100 million people or so last year, but there's 1 billion, 2 billion people who we really want to have an impact. So if we can take what we do in the field and use that to understand what policies make the biggest difference for people, and then work to change those policies, both in the countries in which we are working or policies that we as the U.S. or other rich nations can shift that will help to sustain change, then we're doing a lot more and amplifying the work that we do at the country level by also working at the policy level. So we feel like it's a big part, equal part to our programmatic work, is making sure that we're thinking about how do we use what we know to shift policies that can then have a greater impact on even more people. It's why we hope that all of you will take a look at this and become members of the Care Action Network. And I know there are a lot of Care Action Network members here. We have this network of over almost 200,000 people in this country who can write letters to their congresspeople, who can make sure that there is a voice for the voiceless here in this country. Every year we have a conference in Washington where people learn about the issues and then go lobby their congresspeople. And it's one of these things, I always say it's one of the most inspiring things that I do in my job is when we have that conference. And I don't know who's been to it. It's really wonderful because you see ordinary citizens who never thought about the fact that they could go in and talk to their congressperson and really have results, and how the power of somebody who is not me, I'm paid to, this is part of my job. I go and talk to congresspeople, hopefully they listen, but it's different when it's the person who they know is sending them to office and who is taking their own dollar and going there because they believe in it. And so it's huge power, and I think we don't utilize that power enough.
I might add just a quick note. I mean, I was just on the Hill with some folks that were not paid professionals but volunteer constituents last week, and it just like at some point I just sort of sit back and watch.
It's magical.
Yeah, I mean, and so, but a very interesting thing's also happening. I've just reinforced the need for strong advocacy around these issues. I mean, sometimes it's because of financial concerns about where the money's being allocated in this sort of environment, but often it's at a quite targeted, policy issue that we care a lot about because, again, in our work, our job is actually to say we've identified something that works. Now let's get it, implemented to scale, and that's usually going to require some government action. Get it part of a curriculum. Get it part of get it through a registration process with a government agency or something. But what we've also done, so we have a large advocacy arm in the space we're in. We're also one of the Gates Foundation's for core advocacy partners, so do a lot of the advocacy work for on behalf of the Gates Foundation, but in the technical side. But what we're really working on now, which I think is super exciting, is advocacy in other countries. So we actually are not only building capacity in many of our country officers around the world, and going, literally working on teaching, training. How do you go talk to your parliamentarians? How do you go talk to what are the kinds of tools you need? How can you can learn from each other? How do you bring together people to learn how to become advocates for health and development? And it's really paying off in big ways. I could go through about 5 cool examples, but it's just a really great next generation work, which I think is probably important to put a little context. Is I think in addition to the trends in global health and development of more corporate engagement, more scale, some of the things that Helene and I've talked about, probably the biggest trend, people always say, well, what are the big 3 or 4 things going on? And I think the biggest trend is what's going on geopolitically. I mean, we are seeing the world change so dramatically, and therefore how and where, I've sort of, the shorthand I often use is the global health and development industry, if you will, or sector, is moving from a supply-side export business, mainly out of Geneva and London and Seattle and DC and a few other countries deciding where, to a demand-side import business, where countries are saying, we are responsible for our own development, this is what we need, these is how we want to partner. Now that's not uniform, and it's going to take a lot of time for that to fully happen, and there'll always be exceptions, but that's the shift that's going on. So to the degree that sort of advocacy can also be sort of driven at the country level is exquisite.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Is it okay with you if I open up for questions? So I don't know if we have mics for, probably we can hear you, right? Speak up, please. Anybody has questions? Yes, Teresita.
Thank you for your comments. I'm curious, given the focus on long-term sustainability, on your perspective relative to the nexus between climate change and global health.
Yeah.
You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I was going to say it would be nice to,
Say who you are.
My name is Teresita Heiser. And
Right.
I spent a lot of time down in the Department of Development.
Yeah.
If the presenters could repeat the question so we can capture
Sure.
You
So the
repeat?
question was about the interconnection between, with the focus on sustainability, the interconnection between climate change and global health, and I'll also talk about it from the standpoint of global development, but if you want to.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, it's top of mind for most professionals working in the space that this is a kind of a shift that's going to have a number of implications, and I can sort of just off the top of my head. One is certainly there's a direct linkage between where some of the sort of the factors that are climate change drives are going to affect the poorest, most vulnerable communities, and one of the first things it is already beginning to happen is affect their health, and so there's a direct linkage, and so there's a conscious sort of set of thinking about, well, what does that mean for our? I did it today. There was a planning on our nutrition strategy, and how does that fit into that strategy, and so there's that. There is also clearly at the sort of policy level, sort of how do you think about things in policy, and I would say design, how do you think about programs with that in mind, not just climate change, but broader environmental sort of issues in mind. So we've recently, for instance, just released a very big win in global health this year, one of many actually, but is a semi-synthetic artemisinin, which is the drug that really is one of the key drugs in malaria control. It's usually come from a natural product, and part of the challenge is it was always very volatile, the marketplace was. So to have some supply, not to replace it, but to have some supply of a semi-synthetic model actually helps stabilize the pricing and try to get out of the cycle of pricing up and down that happens because of droughts or other natural phenomena. But so you have to start, you're actually designing products with that sort of notion of mind, or like we've designed ways to get rid of needles in a more safe and environmentally effective way. The final is there's a huge debate going on, and Helene knows as much more about this than I do, but well, we've both been involved in it, is in the global architecture for health and development, and frankly, at the UN level, at where do we go in the next sort of after 2015 when the MDGs, the Millennium Development, the first set of Millennium Development Goals, sort of, we go beyond those goals, and the question that is emerging and very at debate is, okay, what issues take priority, and the role that's actually there's a less alignment, I would say. There's more alignment within projects and organizations around what we need to do. At the global funding policy level, there's a lot of noise between where the priorities get set around climate, where the priorities get set around health, around education, around other rights and issues. So that's another level of the debate.
Yeah, and just to add kind of from the broad, just overall development, clearly climate change is probably one of the biggest factors affecting our work overall, because as Steve said, the communities that are already vulnerable are the ones that are being most hit by the impact of climate change. And so our work has really incorporated a focus on not only responding to the emergencies that are more frequent, the flooding and the droughts that are becoming more frequent. I was just in Benin in West Africa a couple of months ago, and we were visiting a little village on right on a river, and they said they used to have flooding about every 10 to 15 years, and now every year they're having flooding because of all the climate change and wiping out everything. And so their biggest concern was, how do we build the kind of resilience, recognizing the fact that these things are coming more often. So we're really looking at how do you respond to emergencies and natural disasters, but more, how do you build that resiliency into communities, because these communities are going to be facing this, and you can't move all the communities. You can't keep going through the cycle of being wiped out or having, because of flooding, or having all your crops destroyed because crops come in late because of drought, et cetera. So how do you start building that sort of resiliency? And we're really looking at how do you build communities' ability to adapt to those. So just a simple example, for instance, in Bangladesh, working with communities that are, on the coastal areas where they're constantly, not coastal area, but where they're constantly having cyclones and flooding. And just a simple thing like shifting from women who used to primarily raise chickens to learning to instead raise ducks, because ducks float. And I mean, it's a very simple example, but it's the kind of thing that people don't think about. There are ways in which you can adapt. There are ways in which and ducks, give eggs and, produce just like chickens, but they float. So they're much more, resilient. Again, I give a lot of kind of examples, but it's working with communities to figure out that given this, how do you make sure that people's livelihoods, how do you help people store grain so that when the drought situations come, there's actually food stores, and and on and on. So it's a huge part of the work that we're doing.
Thank you. Let's take a question in the back. Okay.
Thanks for speaking with us today. Question for Helene. You had mentioned, I'm very excited to hear that here one of your objectives is to revolutionize the industries or the sectors that produce food. So fishing, but clearly agriculture as well. You had mentioned that you're doing some really interesting work with General Mills and Walmart in incorporating smallholder farmers in more value chain participation. But one area I see that is extremely neglected in the developing world is enabling smallholder farmers in the communities to develop more agroecological methods in terms of inputs, compost, fertilizers, biological fertilizer, inoculums, and so forth, that they could domestically produce, and that would contribute to the production of their crops and not be so totally dependent on imported synthetic products that are brought forward. You're not ignoring them, but at least incorporating them into a more holistic model of a sustainable agriculture. Is CARE doing any work looking at how can you impact and improve the agricultural input infrastructures so that you have really a sustainable program?
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, I think, we feel very strongly that in order for agriculture to be sustainable, it really needs to have inputs that are local, that can be maintained, that aren't reliant on a particular producer or a particular strain or something that is modified with technologies that wouldn't be locally available. So while we look at the whole range of, particularly thinking about can we get more drought-resistant seeds and inputs, et cetera, really mainly focusing on how do we make sure that smallholder farmers are doing things in a sustainable way that is locally adaptable, and making that the core of what they do. And yeah.
Emma, do you want to?
Emma, I am co-founder of a small nonprofit here. We work with education and how we can use technology in developing countries. Sounds like one of the themes is sustainability. I'm interested in, there is kind of a focus on we need to think locally, and we need to think about our footprint and how that affects your organization, specifically on the operation side, and also on how you connect with your donors.
Explain a little bit what you mean about how you connect with your donors.
I think that a donor that goes and sees is very committed to the organization. You know, when you touch it, you really understand what the issue is. I think we are getting to a point where it's not sustainable for all of us to go see. And we should be able to touch our donors without the expense of
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and frankly, not something I've thought a lot about. But I think your point is well taken. That all of us need to start thinking differently about the things that have unintended consequences. Just like your footprint. I mean, how many times? I mean, even forget our donors. Just how many times do we, as a staff, make trips, which is very much a part of our work. It's very much a part of staying connected with what we do, but it does have that unintended consequence. I think in a small way, what we're trying to do is to look at how can technology be more of an enabler. How can we, instead of hopping on a plane all the time, how can we use video conferencing? How can we be better about using our web as a way of connecting donors to the work so that people don't all feel like the only way to feel like you have a connection is by hopping on a plane and getting there? And so I think we're trying to look at ways of doing that and being smarter about that, bringing the experience of the field to people. That said, and back on your point about advocacy, one of the most powerful things to change people's minds and attitudes is to see it. We're involved with, also from a Gates Foundation grant, doing learning tours to take congressional leaders and other policymakers out to see the work. And, it's one of the things that has been so hugely important for shifting people who might have thought, foreign aid was for just, kind of, as the proverbial, pouring money down a rat hole. When they see, we had a trip where a congressman and his daughter went and had a baby that died in front of their very eyes, a child who had a preventable disease, diarrhea, and dehydration. That wakes people up. And so, there is this balance between how important it is to get people to see and connect on a real level and what the unintended consequences are. But it's a good question, and I think it's one that we all have to continue to struggle with thinking about.
And just very briefly, again, I think you have to really do the balance. Also, even one of the criticisms of large NGOs is they get, too many projects fly off the wheel, and and so even from a management and leadership perspective, there's no better way to lead than showing up. And so you've got to really weigh that in. I would say, for instance, we've taken a very conscious view of our carbon footprint, looking at sort of, couldn't we do some things to reduce it and mitigate it? We actually have a whole suite of policies and procedures that we're working on, and even including some carbon trading, et cetera. So there's that. The second is, with every product we're developing now, which is very cool. So we have over 200 products in our pipeline, and we have a lot, in our actual work, and then a number. We actually have, in addition to sort of work on what's the particular target product profile for the scientific issue or the regulatory issue, and we have a very strong one about cost, because cost is the most important piece for access. But we actually have an environmental component now that has to go through a review process to say, are we developing this tool or this product, or are we creating a packaging for that vaccine in a manner that hits a number of exceedingly rigorous standards around this stuff. So we're really trying to incorporate it into our product development thinking.
Great. Let's take a question from this side. Yes.
Elizabeth Guyman with Save the Children. I had a question for Ms. Gayle. Have you ever exited a country because they no longer required your services? And if so, how did that come to pass? Was it government? Was it local? And what was CARE's role in that process?
Yeah, thanks. We've exited countries for a number of different reasons. Sometimes and often one of the most important one is safety and security of our staff, and we've had to exit countries where it just was no longer feasible to operate because it was too dangerous. And while we're serious about our mission in helping people in the countries we work, we have to keep our staff safe. So that's been a big reason for exiting some of the countries that we've exited. But we also have exited countries or evolved, or as we say, kind of evolved countries that have reached a point where the same sort of engagement is no longer necessary. So look at a country like Thailand that about 15 years ago became an independent member of CARE that was no longer a country office. It became its own national entity. The same for Peru and now India. And we're looking at how can we have countries, particularly in a lot of the middle income countries, that can sustain activities on their own, that can do their own fundraising, that have the kind of technical capabilities to do that, and to become much more locally owned and nationally owned with their own boards, and really become fabric of those of those countries. And so that's what we're really trying to do. And I think there's a whole range of countries that we know in very unstable conditions where that may not be possible for a long time. But for those that we can exit out of, if you will, and make them really become much more locally and nationally owned, then that's part of our goal.
Did you want to add to that?
Well, the same thing. In fact, we just are in the process of transferring our Thai office to a local NGO. So the same thing. The interesting sort of little bit of a footnote on it is we're actually finding, partly again because of our innovation work and our product development, and is that we're actually kind of, in a way, re-entering some countries. So now we see less. For instance, we have a robust presence in China, and it doesn't provide, well, with one small exception, it doesn't do anything directly in China where there's, but what we are doing is tapping into Chinese R&D, tapping into Chinese manufacturing, working very closely with the resources that China can provide for the rest of the world and us in our collaboration. So we're actually kind of finding there's a new kind of arc that's beginning to emerge in the country landscape.
Let's take a question.
My name is Shabina. I had a question for Ms. Gayle, and first of all, I want to thank both of you and also for being here and for organizing this. That has been a very, for me personally, it has been a very educational event. My question was, what struck me was you were talking about policy changes and shared values. I have my background in public health. I do care about poorest of the poor. That's my personal. You said shared values and partnering with corporations. What came to my mind was what happened in Bangladesh. There was this huge building collapse, and so many workers died. The corporations hardly cared for the life of poor workers. Like, they are for profit. And when the philanthropic world intersects with for-profit corporations, how do we, probably you can educate us, how can there be a position that philanthropy or the world that cares, as your name says, cares for the poorest of the poor, and you try to maintain that balance?
Thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, it's complicated, and that was, I know everybody in this room, that was such a very, very tragic and sad situation, and not totally unique. We know that these things do happen. I think a few things. I mean, from our perspective, we're very, we do a lot of due diligence around the companies and corporations that we do engage with, because we do feel like it is important that if we're going to be in partnership, that we have partners that we really feel have the same sorts of values that we do. That said, even with that, it is tough to work in some of the environments that we work in. And the reality is that even corporations who have pretty stringent worker codes, a lot of the work that they do uses contractors who may or may not have the same level of rigor around some of their work codes. And I think it is this challenge that people continue to have around how do you make sure that your whole supply chain is actually adhering to the highest standards and highest values when some of that is governed by local laws, which may or may not be different, different standards. So I think it's a battle, and I think all we continue to do, and I think the broader community that cares about these issues, is that it is around holding people accountable. And when things that awful happen, how do we make sure that we're all holding people accountable, asking the right questions, pushing? One of our partners is GAP, that is, involved in some of the garment worker issues. I think they have done a huge amount to make sure that what they're doing in their supply chain meets stringent standards. Again, Walmart that I mentioned earlier, also involved in it. So I think all of us who engage have a responsibility to make sure that we keep asking the tough questions, not because we want to beat up on anybody, but because we believe that it will make everybody better if we can continue to ask those tough questions and push for the kind of policy change that's necessary.
Yeah, that's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
Steve, did you want to add?
No, just
Thank you.
Okay, let's go to you, Lynn.
Thank you. And my name is Lynn Tye from Congressman Smith's office. The question is, it addressed, I think, coattailing your statement about addressing the questions about how, some of the reason why we exit countries because of safety reasons and so on and so forth. And, and at the paradigm, at the center of that is the paradigm that's been going on for so long, is that countries' policies may center around security first, then development. Right? It's like the notion of having security as a paramount, as somehow a requirement before you're able to have meaningful development. I'm wondering what's your thoughts around some ways in which you have thought about maybe we'll flip that around. Maybe it's development is the cause and actually is the backbone of national and regional and international security. And by raising and bringing those kind of focus and kind of thought leadership around that we're able to make a shift, a fundamental shift in terms of policy that would lead to that kinds of a focus shifting away from security first development, but it is because of development, therefore we have stable long-term security. Maybe you have
Yeah.
I can take one crack at it, but because I think it kind of depends what you mean by security. I mean, if you're thinking about broader sort of national economic, the health and economic development as part of security, then I think there's a very conscious view, at least in most of the work that our two organizations do and others, that says that we're part of the reason we do what we do is to support sort of the economic and social development strategies and policies of different countries, in support of those. So it becomes, therefore, part of the diplomatic approach why the U.S. government funds this. It's not purely for humanitarian, but it's also as part of their strategy for diplomacy and defense. And so I think increasingly there's pretty good evidence. Now, sometimes, politics get in the way. We've just seen an extraordinary thing. I think one of the other big health wins is in the last couple years a meningitis A vaccine, which was developed. PATH was the main intermediary with WHO and UNICEF, but really made a vaccine that very few kids die of anywhere else in the world, but there's this meningitis belt of Africa where it's kind of in the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa, across, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and then all the way to Kenya. And it's there every year. This is the most destabilizing aspect of family life. This disease just knocks out families, kids. It accounts for an enormous amount of this, and there's limited national treasury around health. And now we've actually just saw the report today that we will see 200 million kids or people receive this in the next, and nobody's getting sick. I mean, so already you're seeing the impact something like that has on stability, family stability, then community stability, then national stability in actually some of the most vulnerable and unstable countries of the world. So I think there are connections that are pretty clear. I'm not sure it's our role to come in and redefine national policy versus health versus security, but I think demonstrating and giving tools to help health in our instance and development more broadly will lend itself to that result.
Yeah, and I think that there's a huge focus on this whole notion of the balance of power and using kind of a smart power approach. That security is going to be enhanced by diplomacy, defense, and development, and that development, i.e. all the things that we're talking about, is an equal pillar. And, I think the fact that we now have generals and ex-generals going and saying to Congress that, in fact, we believe that it makes sense to do more on the development side if we want to enhance our national security, and that educated populations are less unstable, et cetera. So I think people are starting to really accept that as a mainstream argument. Now we just need the dollars to follow.
And I would say that view is not is a bipartisan view. I mean, I was talking to a number of very conservative Republican senators last week, and they're sharing that view.
Yeah.
Now, they may have a different view on allocation of some of the funds, but that's not.
Let's take a question here first, and then we'll go in the back.
My name is Fauzia Ali. I'm glad today to be here and meet with Helen and the representative of Bath. I'm a former care employee in East Africa, Somalia. And my question is addressed to Helen about food aid. I know you are doing a lot of advocacy, and there are some obstacles that you cannot pass, but being in Africa and being in the field and knowing what bringing food aid, the little impact that it can make, and if instead of bringing food, if you invest on agriculture or roads or market linkages, the bigger impact that it can bring. I wonder what is going to be next step. I know you tried your advocacy, and we all tried to push our representatives, but what will be the next step if you don't have that much funding from the U.S. government?
Great, thank you. And my question to you is, why are you an ex-CARE member? You should, you should be the president of CARE. But, thank you.
Back to one of the points you said, we sometimes have to phase out countries because of security.
Yeah, right.
I had to come out of the
Right.
country because of security.
Yeah.
I would love to go back and give back to the community, but I think it's sometimes you have to phase out and helping it for a while, and then maybe willing to go back. And soon maybe I heard that there's some changes going on, so I may be going back there.
Thank you
Well,
very
great.
much.
Thank
Everybody
you.
hear the question? Food aid reform, kind of. You know?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And it is a issue that is, as you know, a very, very particular issue for CARE. I mean, partly because our roots are in food and food security. It's how we started. And we took a position about 6 years ago to actually phase out of a process called monetization, which is part of what you're talking about, where we took subsidized food from U.S. farmers and then shipped it on American carriers, then converted that to money, essentially flooded local markets with American surplus products, and use that money for development programs. Well, there's a few reasons why we thought that was just not the right practice. I mean, first of all, it's hugely expensive. So just the whole transaction of buying the food here, shipping it on specific carriers, storing it, then taking that commodity and translating it to money. Well, it was estimated it lost something like 30 cents on every dollar. Well, that was, enough of a reason because it wasn't a good use of taxpayers' money. But in addition, as you said, what it was doing in many ways was actually being exactly counter to what we were trying to do, because it was depressing the local agricultural productivity in countries where agriculture is the economic engine. So we just decided that even though, some might say it was a bit, cutting your own nose to spite your face because we gave up money as a result of it, but we just felt in principle that we wanted to take a stand, and we felt that it was a way of starting the dialogue around reforming food aid. We're pleased that in this year's president's budget, there's actually a request for reforms along those lines to end monetization, to use that money directly for development assistance instead of going through that monetization. To do that would feed somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 million more people with the same money. So in a time when we're talking about government efficient use of resources, it would be a much more efficient use of resources and provide funding for local purchase of food so that you can buy food that is grown locally or regionally, get it to countries much more rapidly, particularly in emergency situations. So it's a big focus right now, and I know some of you in the room are involved in some of the work on it. You know, we're not sure that this year those reforms will take place, but if you don't start somewhere and keep pushing, then they never will. So it's a big focus and one that I hope people in this room will get engaged with.
Thank you. Let's take a question on this side, and then we'll go to Marty. All the way in the back.
My name is Tazeen. I'm a Microsoft employee, but we also have a small nonprofit that we run.
Would you speak up, please?
Okay. We have a small nonprofit that we run in Bangladesh where we provide healthcare and education for kids who live in the urban slum areas. And one of the questions I had is, what advice would you have for young nonprofits that just started, so that we don't make some of the same mistakes?
Good question.
Well, it comes up a fair amount, and I have to say, I'm always worried if anybody looks to me for kind of career advice or any other kind of advice. That's a dubious prospect. But so look, I mean, part of it is it's every year things change. So there's a lot of things that I learned when I was a young entrepreneur, trying both social and business entrepreneur, are less relevant today. So I'm not sure. But, you know, part of it is keep that, you know, passion high and the focus tight. And I'd say one of the things you see a lot, and it's in business as in the NGO world, is that it's so easy. Mission creep is even harder in NGO world than it is in business, and it's hard in business. But and so I would urge you, you know, because it's so easy, because there's no bad idea in a way. I mean, because you can help people in so many different ways. So, and then the second is, I gave a talk at an event yesterday. It's like, you know, it's about great ideas. It's about great, you know, communities to support the idea, and that's about great institution building. And I think we sometimes think that idea substitutes for good institutional, you know, and it's a lot about, do I have the management issues buttoned up? Do I have the capacity that I need to support the systems? Have I kicked the tires enough before I leap too fast? Now, the good entrepreneur will say, don't do too much of that, and both of us are now in large enough institutions that there's probably a lot of bureaucracy that does a lot of that. But, you know, be very conscious of that institution building early on, because that's true for growing a small business, but it's really true for growing a small NGO.
Yeah, I would just say ditto, and also, you know, thinking about how do you link with others, because oftentimes, you know, when you're starting small enterprises, it's easy to kind of just think, all right, I've got this. And to the point of the institution building, I think sometimes by linkages, you're able to stay focused on what's your real niche and not do the mission creep, but then work with others that can enhance what you're doing, but you can stay focused on your mission. So I think it's, you know, making sure that you're looking inward to make sure your organization is doing all the things that Steve said, but also looking outward to see where can you make linkages so that you can stay focused on what you do best.
And as Churchill said, just don't give up, don't give up, don't give up, right? You know, that's the main thing. Yeah.
Marty.
Marty Koistra, Habitat for Humanity. I'm going to be a little selfish. I'm also on the board of Coble Washington. And you see in action here the strengthening of our member organizations, the convening, and also definitely an emphasis on advocacy. The question I have is do you have any thoughts about whether or not we should be more proactive as an organization, now 5 years old, in brokering more proactive relationships, whether that be geographically or sectorally, to help align all of this energy and the number of organizations more closely? We know when we're on the ground, we trip over each other. We learn that, and then we come back and we talk about it. But is self-interest so powerful that we can't get to a point where we eliminate some of the redundancy in the administration and that sort of realm of sustainability concerns? Or does Global Washington have a role now with its credibility in trying to help formulate stronger alliances around actual high-level impact initiatives?
Well, knowing nothing about Global Washington and not living here, I can give you the answer. No, I shouldn't say I know nothing about Global Washington, but obviously I'm an outsider to the group. But I guess I would say, having worked in lots of groups that try to move from what is a great information sharing forum, which is wonderful because things sometimes just happen organically because people are in the rooms together and they hear good discussion and they do the networking, but trying to move from that to something more organized and structured. I think there is sometimes value in that if you do it in a very focused way, because as everybody knows, coordination is a full-time job. And we all have, I'm sure, had experiences where you try to do some grand master coordination strategy and it just falls apart because it becomes too artificial, too big, and too cumbersome, and people have other things that they need to do. So is there one thing that you might want to say, you pull together as a project that you want to just try to see if you could do that in a way that brings people together, but not trying to take on and do a whole big master blueprint and whatever. But there may be one thing. I think about in Atlanta, we have a consortium of groups that are either global health or global development between the CDC and Emory University and the Carter Center and our equivalent of Global Washington, the World Affairs Council, and so for years we've been trying to think about how could we have some grand master project that we work on? And it keeps falling apart. So we've just started with a couple of small things that are working very well around global health and water. It's a big issue for all of the different organizations, and we've come together, and I think we've done some things because we took something, a specific focus, and started working on that as opposed to saying, now how can we have some super plan to coordinate everybody?
Yeah, I would be cautious. I mean, I actually think that, first of all, we just talked about mission creep, and that's mission lurch, maybe. Yeah. And so, you got to be a little careful there. And then secondly, I mean, and I've been very involved. I was actually one of the conveners of getting the variety of global health organizations to the governor's office to get, okay, we should be talking to each other. And I've been on the board or run most of them, so half of them. So, but so many of the sort of the affinity in terms of project work. Now, not necessarily in terms of state policy. So maybe if there's a state policy question about R&D in the state, or facility management more coordinated across these different facilities. I mean, there's a natural affinity there. But a lot of the affinity on the project level is often not within this cluster. I mean, it's maybe in some ways it's here as much as it's across the street. And so, given the nature of global development and health kind of institutions, I think sort of trying to force too many marriages might not be as productive.
All right, we have 5 minutes to go. How many questions in total? Raise your hand. Here's what I'm going to do if it's okay. I'm going to take 3 questions at once. Ask 3 people to stand up and ask your questions and see if we could answer some of them. Jonathan, let's start with you.
Sure. Jonathan Scanlon from Oxfam. Steve, one of the things you said earlier was the change you're seeing in the world, kind of shifting from the supply-driven aid and NGO model to more demand-driven. I'm starting to see some policies that are changing more in that direction. So food aid reform was mentioned earlier, shifting some of our funding to buying food locally. Another is the initiative that Administrator Shah has put out, USAID, starting to put 30% of their funding into local organizations. USAID is talking about budget support, something on, you go talking Capitol Hill, not our Capitol Hill here, but the other Capitol Hill, and that scares a lot of people. You see the G8 this year, big focus this year on tax issues, on transparency issues in the extractive industry sector. So I'm wondering, it seems as if the NGO sector may not be set up well to respond to some of these things. You've seen some pushback in the NGO community from some of these policy shifts. So what do we need to do to change our business models in the NGO community to respond to that. And what do we need to do as members of the NGO community, leaders in the NGO community, to bring our colleagues along with us?
That was 3 questions in one. All right,
And that's a 2-hour lecture, too.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a big question.
Let's go take a couple on this side.
Hi, I'm Melita Skull, and I'm on the board of the World Affairs Council. Bukta and I and another person had a conversation over Skype about a month ago regarding how it seems like the fabulous foundations go and they do triage, which is so critical, and then they get to a certain level, and it's hard to get beyond that point. And so social entrepreneurship is a fabulous way to start moving beyond that point. And so I'm most interested in growing economies. And one of the sticking points for that is the financial system in the economies. If they don't have a financial system, it's pretty hard. You were talking about the money and the food. It's pretty hard to keep that economy growing and then finally growing the middle class. So are there foundations that do work on the financial system to help the growth of the economies in the developing countries?
All right, let's take one more.
Hi, my name is Jackie. I work for an international development consulting firm called Creative Associates. My question is, within the development sector, we hear a lot of talk about improving how we monitor and evaluate our programs, showing impact and sharing the results of evaluation. But I also fear that as funding decreases in the sector, there's also the temptation for organizations to be more competitive and really pump up their positive results and maybe not talk as much about unintended consequences or things that not go as well. So I'm curious how you as heads of organization really are promoting really rigorous evaluation, learning, and the transparency to really talk about when things don't go so well, and really sharing that with the organization, and also collaborating with other organizations and making sure that we are learning from what we're doing and moving development field forward.
Geez, those are like really big 3 questions.
Yes, no, no, yes, no. That's it.
No.
I'll take a real quick try because I think they're actually woven together in some ways. I am first of all, there are organizations that are focused on financial services for the poor and for a variety of financial inclusion, and including organizations that are giving money to support entrepreneurship in order to look at development. So there's some, but I actually think this shift. This country ownership model that AID is endorsing. I mean, it's a good thing. I mean, that's it may be, like so many policy shifts, it may actually get deployed in ways that don't fully work. It may get communicated with, but what it's saying is we're seeing development has been successful in many instances, and people have capabilities, and institutions work in many places better than they did 30 years ago, and we should be responsive to communities' needs based on what they define as their needs, not that we do. And so the broader arc is good. The problem is it's probably a little bit too much of a one-size-fits-all, and we need to change. There are lots of challenges. So the answer isn't going backwards to the good old days, which weren't that good anyway. The answer is clearly adjusting business models, and in adjusting those business models, which I know CARE has been doing, which PATH is right in the middle of re-engineering, and it has a lot to do with understanding the value proposition. So the measurement and work is not just for, a donor is saying we have to measure and work, but we have to actually demonstrate our return or our value proposition in a very new and I think could be potentially exciting way, but it's going to get hard. It's not easy, and so I'm quite positive about it. I know it's torturous. I know that a lot of programs are going to have to shut or shift or move, but it's going to be better for us in the long run.
Yeah, and just to kind of amplify, I totally agree. I mean, we're going through a big restructuring, looking at varying our footprint to look at how do you meet the different needs, understanding that, in some countries we ought to be very, very small as an organization and be supporting partners in the field primarily, and having a much smaller presence than we've had in the past. And so, I think organizations like CARE and others should shrink. I mean, we should be smaller. We should be looking at what's our comparative advantage because we are global. There are things that we can do that a local NGO may not have access to. when they're thinking only in a country context, may not have, some of the things that you have when you're thinking more in a global context, et cetera. But we should really be rethinking that, and we are, and recognizing that our role needs to continue to shift to be able to meet that very different world today, and to really, as I say, we all talk about, we should be putting ourselves out of business, and we should be serious about that, and not looking at preservation of an organization just to say, we were big, this is who we were, and that's who we should always be. If our goal is to help the most poor people possible, then how do we really make sure that we have the organization to do that? On the entrepreneurship, totally agree. It's a huge issue. It's one that we're doing a lot of work. How do you develop the ecosystem that is important to be able to support business and business development? Because, doesn't poverty have something to do with economics and economic growth? And so if we're not also looking at economic growth as a real engine for change, I think that we're also missing the boat on that. And I think there are more opportunities. There are a lot more people who are talking about impact investing and thinking about making investments as opposed to grants. So I think there's a big shift in the thinking around some of those sorts of things. And on the monitoring and evaluation, it is important. But I think as organizations, we need to think about, stop thinking about it so much about satisfying our donors and think about how is it actually making our programs better. And I think when you make that shift in your thinking, it frees you in some ways from worrying about what the results are and really thinking about how is it helping you do your job better. Tough, because there's a big push from you want to please your donors and all the rest of it. But I think if you just kind of shift that frame a little bit, I think it does help some of the thinking around that. And I think more and more donors are really much more interested in honest dialogue than in the past, and really are asking, tell us about your mistakes. Stop trying to pretend as if everything, because we're with you on this journey, and we'll be with you a lot more if you tell us as much about your mistakes as the successes, because that's where you learn. I mean, we all learn more from failure in a way than we do from our own successes. So anyway. I mean, I know I do. I've made enough of them but anyway. Yes.
I want to thank you both for your incredibly insightful comments. Thank you. It's really an honor for me to be here with Helene and Steve. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate all of you being here with us. So come back to future events, and I'm sure we have a few minutes still if you want to keep networking and meet each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.